You know, after 40 years on this bench, I've learned that silence is one of the most misunderstood things in a courtroom. People think silence means defiance, or guilt, or disrespect. But sometimes silence just means someone doesn't have the words. The morning an immigrant father stood in front of me, unable to explain his ticket in English, I saw how quickly dignity can be taken away when we rush to judgment. What happened next reminded me why respect is just as important as the law itself. Let me tell you exactly what happened that day, because it's a story about patience, humanity, and what justice looks like when it chooses to listen. But before I tell you this whole story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share with you is something that needs to be heard. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single word of this. I've been a judge in Providence for a long time, and my mornings rarely change. I wake up early, make my coffee strong and black, and sit at the kitchen table with the paper spread out in front of me. My wife always tells me I read it too slowly, but I like to start the day grounded. My father used to say you can't serve people well if you rush through the world. That lesson has stayed with me. By 8:15, I'm walking into the courthouse like I've done thousands of times. Christina greets me, hands me my coffee, and tells me the docket is full. I thank her and take a sip. It's hot, bitter, familiar. Some days you need that. I sit down and begin reviewing the files. Minor violations, tickets, missed obligations. On paper, everything looks routine. But there's one file that makes me pause, not because it's serious, not because it's complicated, but because there's a note written in the margin that simply says, language barrier. I lean back in my chair and look at that line for a moment. Over the years, I've learned that those two words can carry more weight than any charge listed on the page. Language barriers don't just stop communication. They can strip confidence. They can create fear. And in a courtroom, fear can look a lot like guilt if you're not careful. When court begins, the first few cases move quickly. People explain themselves. Some apologize. Some argue. Decisions are made. The rhythm is familiar, but my eyes keep drifting back to that file. Then Christina calls the next case. I look up and see him standing near the podium already. He's not young, but not old either. His posture is stiff, like he's trying very hard not to do anything wrong. He's holding a folded piece of paper with both hands, gripping it tightly. His clothes are clean but worn, work clothes, the kind that tell you he came straight from a long shift or is headed to one. I ask him to step forward. He does, but slowly, carefully. When he looks up at me, his eyes are wide, uncertain. I ask him to state his name. He tries. The pronunciation comes out broken, hesitant. He immediately says, sorry, not once, twice, 3 times. That catches my attention. I ask him where he's from. He answers with the name of his country, softly, but with pride. His accent is thick. His words are careful, like he's afraid of saying the wrong thing. I ask him about the ticket. He freezes. He looks down at the paper in his hands, then back up at me. His mouth opens, then closes. He says sorry again. He tries to explain, but the words don't come out right. He gestures instead. His hands move, trying to fill in the gaps his language can't. I watch his hands shake. I ask him a simpler question. Yes or no? He nods. But I can tell he's guessing. Guessing is dangerous in a courtroom. Guessing can make someone look dishonest when they're just confused. I feel the tension in the room rise. I hear a quiet sigh from somewhere behind him, not cruel, impatient, and that's all it takes sometimes. One sigh to make someone feel smaller. I lean forward slightly and tell him it's okay. I tell him to take his time. He nods quickly, relief flickering across his face, then disappearing again when he realizes he still doesn't have the words. He says sorry again. That's when I realize something important. This man isn't being evasive. He's being respectful to the point of fear. He's afraid of authority, afraid of doing something wrong, afraid that not understanding might cost him more than a fine. I ask him how long he's been in this country. He answers with a number of years. Not many. Enough to work, enough to build a life, not enough to feel secure. I ask him if he understands why he's here. He nods, then shakes his head, then nods again. Confusion, pure confusion. I remove my glasses and set them down carefully. I do that when I want to slow myself down. I look at him again, really look at him, and I see something I've seen before in my courtroom. Embarrassment, the kind that burns quietly. I ask him if English is difficult for him. He nods immediately. Relief floods his face like he's finally been asked the right question. He says yes, very difficult. He apologizes again. I tell him he doesn't need to apologize for that. The room is quieter now. People are listening differently. I can feel it. I think about my father, about how he came to this country speaking almost no English, about how many times he must have stood in front of people feeling the same way this man feels right now. I think about how easily someone could have dismissed him as ignorant or uncooperative. I look back at the file. The ticket itself is minor, something that could be explained in 30 seconds if the language wasn't in the way. But language is in the way, and right now it's standing between this man and his dignity. I ask him one more question, slowly, clearly. I ask if he understands what I'm saying. He hesitates, then shakes his head just slightly. Honest, brave enough to admit it. That matters. Before I go any further, let me pause here for just a moment. I want to ask you something. Have you ever been judged simply because you couldn't express yourself the way others expected you to? If you have, leave me a comment and tell me your story. And if you're still with me, hit that like button so this story reaches people who need to hear it. I look at Christina and give her a small nod. She understands immediately. We've worked together long enough that words aren't always necessary. I turn back to him and speak slowly, calmly. I tell him we're going to take a moment. I tell him I want to make sure he's understood, not just heard. His eyes widen slightly. He nods again, gripping that paper just a little less tightly. The courtroom waits. And in that pause, I realize something important. Justice doesn't begin with punishment. It begins with understanding. And sometimes understanding means admitting that the system needs to slow down. What I did next changed the entire tone of that courtroom. It changed the way this man stood. And it reminded everyone present that respect costs nothing, but it can restore everything. Stay with me. Because in the next part, I'll tell you what happened when I decided to slow everything down and why using a translator turned this from a routine case into one of the most meaningful moments I've had on this bench. I remember the way he stood there during that pause. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just waited, like he had learned somewhere along the way that waiting quietly was the safest thing to do. I've seen that posture before. It's the posture of someone who doesn't want trouble, someone who just wants to get through the moment without making it worse. I told him again slowly that we were going to take our time. I said it clearly, even though I wasn't sure how much of it he understood. He nodded anyway. That nod wasn't agreement, it was trust, or maybe hope. I looked around my courtroom and felt the shift. Earlier there had been impatience in the air, not cruelty, just the normal rush of people wanting their cases called. But now people were paying attention. They could see what was happening. A man wasn't being difficult. He was being left behind by the pace of the room. I asked him to tell me, in whatever way he could, what happened. He tried again. He pointed to the paper. He said a few words I could barely make out. He stopped. He shook his head and whispered sorry again, like an automatic response. That's when I felt something inside me firm up. I told him, gently but clearly, that saying sorry wasn't necessary. I told him he wasn't in trouble for not knowing English well. He looked at me then, really looked at me, like he was checking to see if I meant it. I meant it. I asked him if he worked. He nodded quickly and said yes. He mentioned a job, the hours long, the days early. I could hear the pride in his voice even through the broken words. Work is something people hold on to when everything else feels uncertain. I asked him if he had family. His face softened. He nodded and said children. He held up 2 fingers, then 3. He smiled for the first time, just briefly when he said it. That smile told me more than any sentence could have. I asked him if he was worried. He didn't answer right away. Then he nodded slowly, very worried. His hands tightened around the paper again. I thought about how fear multiplies when you don't understand the rules of the room you're in. A courtroom is intimidating even when you speak the language. When you don't, it can feel like the walls are closing in. I asked him if he understood the ticket. He shook his head. He said a word that sounded like no, then said sorry again. The repetition of that word hit me harder than I expected. I've seen people who argue. I've seen people who lie. I've seen people who shrug and don't care. This man was none of those things. He was trying to be respectful in the only way he knew how. I leaned forward and spoke slowly, spacing out my words. I asked him if he knew why he had been stopped. He hesitated, then nodded. He said something about confusion, about signs, about misunderstanding. I caught fragments, enough to know that this wasn't about disregard. It was about interpretation. I looked down at the ticket itself. It was minor, the kind of thing that gets resolved quickly when someone can explain. But explanation requires language, and language was exactly what he didn't have access to in that moment. I felt my jaw tighten, not at him, but at how easily situations like this can spiral when no one intervenes. I looked up at him again and asked, very plainly, if English was hard for him. He nodded immediately, more emphatically this time. He said yes, very hard. He said he tries. That sentence stayed with me. I try. I told him that trying matters. I told him that effort matters. Even if he didn't understand every word I was saying, I wanted him to understand my tone, respectful, patient. The courtroom stayed quiet. No one rushed me. No one interrupted. People were watching something unfold that they don't always see in a courtroom, slowing down. Before I go any further, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever felt embarrassed because you couldn't communicate the way others expected you to? Maybe in a classroom, a workplace, or a government office. If you have, leave me a comment and tell me about it. And if you're still with me, hit that like button for me. I turned back to him and asked him one more question. I asked if he would feel more comfortable speaking in his own language. His eyes widened. He nodded quickly. Yes, much better. That answer settled it for me. I told him we were going to get a translator. I said it clearly, calmly, like it was the most normal thing in the world, because it is. For a moment he didn't react. Then it seemed to register. His shoulders dropped just slightly. Relief. Real relief. I looked around the room and said that everyone deserves to be understood in this courtroom. I said that justice doesn't work if people can't explain themselves. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The room was listening. Christina stepped out to make arrangements. The courtroom waited. No one complained. No one sighed this time. While we waited, I watched him. He stood a little straighter now. He wasn't gripping the paper as tightly. He still looked nervous, but the panic had eased, just a little. I thought again about my father, about how he must have stood in rooms like this once, about how someone taking an extra minute could change everything. I realized something in that pause. Using a translator isn't just about words, it's about respect. It tells someone they're worth the time, that their story matters enough to be heard properly. When Christina returned and nodded at me, I felt ready to finally hear this man's story, not in pieces, not in guesses, but clearly. I looked at him and told him slowly that we were going to start again. I told him he could explain everything. He nodded, eyes focused on me now, not the floor. The atmosphere in the room had changed completely. What started as discomfort had turned into anticipation. People weren't waiting for a ruling anymore. They were waiting to understand. And when the translator finally began to speak, what this man shared revealed far more than a simple explanation of a ticket. It revealed who he was, why he was afraid, and how close he came to being judged unfairly just because he didn't have the right words. Stay with me, because in the next part, I'll tell you what he finally said once he was truly heard, and why his story reminded me that dignity should never depend on language. When the translator stepped forward and took a position beside him, I saw something change immediately. It was subtle, but it was there. His shoulders relaxed just a bit. His breathing slowed. For the first time since he'd been called, he looked like someone who believed he might finally be understood. I introduced the translator and explained slowly and clearly that everything said would be translated exactly. No shortcuts, no summaries, word for word. I wanted him to know that his voice mattered, even if it came through someone else. He nodded, eyes focused on the translator now, like he was anchoring himself to something familiar. I asked my first question again. I asked him to explain what happened the day he received the ticket. This time he spoke freely. The words flowed quickly in his own language, his hands moving as he talked. The translator followed him carefully, keeping pace, giving me a story in clear English. And as it unfolded, the room grew even quieter than before. He explained that he was driving home from work late in the evening. He had taken a route he didn't normally use because of construction. He said the signs were confusing. Some were temporary. Some were partially covered. He said he thought he was following the rules. He explained that when he was stopped, he tried to ask questions, but he didn't understand what the officer was saying. He nodded because that's what he always does when he's confused. He said he was afraid to argue, afraid to seem disrespectful, afraid that making things worse would affect his job or his family. That fear was familiar. He explained that when he received the ticket in the mail, he didn't fully understand it. He recognized numbers, dates, but not the explanation. He said he tried to ask a coworker for help, but their English was limited too. He said coming to court scared him, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. As the translator spoke, I watched his face. He wasn't dramatic. He wasn't defensive. He was simply relieved to finally say what he'd been holding inside. I asked him how long he'd been in this country. He answered through the translator, several years, long enough to work full-time, long enough to pay taxes, long enough to raise children who spoke English better than he did. I asked him what he did for a living. He told me, hard work, long hours, physical labor, the kind of job that leaves you tired before the day even starts. I asked him why he cared so much about this ticket. He answered without hesitation. He said he was afraid of doing something wrong in this country. He said he worked hard to follow the rules. He said he didn't want his children to see him in trouble with the law. That sentence landed heavily. I thought about how many parents carry that same fear, the fear of being seen as a problem instead of a contributor. I asked him if he had ever been in trouble before. He shook his head firmly. The record confirmed it. Clean, no history, no pattern. I asked him how he felt standing in court before the translator arrived. He hesitated, then spoke again in his language. The translator paused briefly before translating, choosing the right words. He said he felt small. He said he felt like a child who couldn't answer a teacher's question. He said he was ashamed, even though he hadn't done anything on purpose. I felt something tighten in my chest when I heard that. I told him through the translator that feeling ashamed for not knowing a language was not something he should ever carry. I told him that learning takes time, that effort matters. He nodded slowly, eyes glossy now. The courtroom stayed silent, no murmurs, no distractions. People were listening, not out of curiosity, but out of respect. Before I continue, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever seen someone misunderstood simply because they couldn't communicate fluently? Or have you ever been that person? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story is resonating with you, hit that like button for me. I turn back to the facts. The ticket itself was minor, a misunderstanding, a situation that could have been resolved with clearer communication from the start. I explained that to him, making sure the translator conveyed every word. I asked him if he understood what I was saying now. He smiled slightly and said yes. He said thank you, not once, several times. I told him that thanking me wasn't necessary. I told him that being heard is a right, not a favor. I looked around the courtroom. Faces were softer now. People leaned forward slightly. They weren't just watching a case. They were watching dignity being restored. I explained to him what the law required in cases like this. I made sure the translator took time with each sentence. I didn't rush. I wanted clarity, not efficiency. He listened carefully. He asked questions through the translator. Real questions. Questions he hadn't been able to ask before. That mattered. As we talked, something became very clear to me. This case was never about enforcement. It was about access. Access to understanding, access to fairness. I thought again about my father, about how many times someone had probably spoken around him instead of to him, about how easily he could have been misunderstood. I looked at the man standing before me and realized that the law had a choice in that moment. It could treat him like a problem to be processed, or it could treat him like a person to be respected. I already knew which path I was taking, but before I delivered my decision, I wanted to say something to the courtroom, something that needed to be said out loud, something about language, respect, and what justice is supposed to look like, because the ruling I was about to give wasn't just for him. It was for everyone listening. Stay with me, because in the next part, I'll tell you what I said, how the room reacted, and why using a translator turned this simple case into one of the most powerful lessons about respect I've seen on this bench. I remember looking out across my courtroom before I said anything else. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The room was already quiet, the kind of quiet that tells you people are listening with more than just their ears. I could feel that this moment had shifted from a simple case to something larger, something worth slowing down for. I leaned forward slightly and spoke calmly, making sure the translator stayed right with me. I said that I wanted everyone in the courtroom to understand something important. I said that language is not intelligence. I said that difficulty with English is not disrespect. And I said that in my courtroom, every person deserves the chance to explain themselves fully. The translator repeated my words carefully. I watched the man's face as he listened. His eyes stayed on the translator, but I could tell he felt the meaning. His posture changed again. He stood a little taller, like a weight he'd been carrying quietly had finally been acknowledged. I told him, through the translator, that I appreciated how hard he was trying. I told him that coming to court when you're afraid, when you don't know the language well, takes courage. He nodded slowly, eyes glossy, swallowing hard. I asked him again about the route he had taken that day. This time, with the translator there, he explained it clearly. He described the construction, the temporary signs, the confusion. He said he genuinely believed he was following the rules. He said if he had known otherwise, he would have corrected it immediately. I believed him. I asked him about his life here. I asked him how long he'd been working, what kind of work he did, and how his family was doing. The translator relayed his answers, and each one painted a picture of a man who was doing his best. Long hours, early mornings, physical work, kids in school, bills paid carefully. Nothing about his story suggested carelessness. I looked back down at the ticket and reviewed it one more time. I wanted to be absolutely certain. The violation was minor. The circumstances were understandable. The record was clean. The confusion was real. I looked back up at him and said through the translator that the law is meant to correct behavior, not punish honest mistakes. I said that when someone is trying to follow the rules and makes an error because of confusion, the court has a responsibility to respond with fairness. The translator paused slightly before delivering that sentence, choosing words that would carry the same weight. When he finished, the man nodded firmly, like he understood not just the words, but the respect behind them. Before I go any further, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever seen a situation change completely just because someone finally took the time to listen? If you have, leave me a comment and tell me about it. And if you believe listening matters, hit that like button for me. I turned my attention back to the courtroom as a whole. I said that America is a country built by people who came here speaking many different languages. I said that expecting perfection from day one ignores our own history. I said that justice doesn't ask where you're from or how you sound. It asks whether you're trying to do the right thing. I could see heads nodding slightly in the gallery. I looked back at the man and told him that I was going to explain my decision very clearly and that I wanted to make sure he understood every part of it. The translator nodded, ready. I explained that given the circumstances, given the confusion, and given his clean record, I was not going to treat this as a punishable offense. I explained that the purpose of this court was not to add fear to someone who was already trying hard to live responsibly. As the translator spoke, I saw the man's hands start to shake again, but this time for a different reason. Relief, pure relief. I told him that I was dismissing the ticket. I said it clearly, slowly. I watched his face as the translator delivered those words. For a moment he didn't react at all. Then his eyes widened. He looked at the translator, then back at me like he needed confirmation that he had heard correctly. The translator repeated it. The man brought his hand to his chest and nodded repeatedly. He said thank you over and over again in his own language. His voice cracked. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect that needed no translation. The courtroom stayed silent. No applause, no noise, just stillness. I told him one more thing before concluding. I told him that he had done nothing wrong by asking for understanding. I told him that learning a new language takes time and that his effort mattered. I told him to keep doing what he was doing. The translator conveyed every word carefully. When he finished, the man wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and nodded. I could feel the emotion in the room, but it was controlled, respectful. People weren't watching a spectacle. They were witnessing dignity being restored. I concluded the case and told him he was free to go. He stepped back slowly, still holding his papers, but not gripping them anymore. As he turned to leave, he looked back at me once more and nodded. Not in relief alone, but in gratitude. That look stayed with me. After he left, I noticed something else. The courtroom didn't immediately return to its usual rhythm. People sat quietly for a few extra seconds. No one rushed forward. It was like everyone needed a moment to absorb what had just happened. I took that moment too. I thought about how close this man had come to being judged, unfairly, not because of what he did, but because of what he couldn't say. I thought about how easily dignity can be lost when patience runs out. I also thought about how powerful it is when someone in authority chooses to slow things down instead of speeding them up. That choice alone can change everything. But the impact of that moment didn't end when he walked out of the courtroom. In the days that followed, I learned something about what that decision meant beyond those walls. Something that confirmed for me that respect, when shown sincerely, doesn't just resolve cases. It changes how people see the system itself. Stay with me, because in the next part, I'll tell you what happened after that day, and why this simple act of using a translator became one of the most meaningful lessons about justice I've experienced in my career. After he left the courtroom, I didn't move right away. I stayed seated for a moment, hands resting on the bench, letting the room breathe. I've learned over the years that some moments shouldn't be rushed past, even when there's a full docket waiting. This was one of those moments. I called the next case and court continued. People stepped forward. Voices returned. Papers shuffled. The rhythm slowly came back. But something had changed, and I could feel it. The energy in the room was different, softer, more attentive. Like everyone had just been reminded that the law is carried out by people, not machines. During a brief pause, Christina leaned toward me and quietly said she'd never seen that man's face change so quickly. I nodded. I told her that relief can look like disbelief when someone hasn't expected fairness. She understood exactly what I meant. When the morning session ended, I went back to my chambers and took off my robe. I hung it carefully, the same way I always do. Routine matters to me, especially after emotional moments. I poured a glass of water and sat at my desk, staring at nothing for a few seconds longer than usual. I thought about how close that case came to going wrong, how easily impatience could have turned confusion into punishment, how a simple decision to slow down changed the entire outcome. I thought about my father again, about how many times he must have felt the same way that man did, standing in a room where every word mattered, but none of them came easily. I wondered how often people like him left places feeling smaller than when they arrived. A few days later, Christina told me something that stayed with me. She said the man had returned to the clerk's desk, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He came with his oldest child, who spoke fluent English. The child translated for him this time. He wanted to say thank you. Not loudly, not publicly, just sincerely. I sat quietly when I heard that. Gratitude like that isn't about the outcome. It's about how someone is treated along the way. Christina said the man explained that he had been terrified walking into court. He thought not understanding English would make him look irresponsible. He thought he might lose his job if things went badly. He thought his children would be disappointed in him. Instead, he left feeling respected. That word again, respected. I reflected on how powerful that feeling is. When someone walks away believing the system treated them fairly, they carry that belief into their community, into their family, into their children's understanding of what justice looks like. I imagined his kids asking him what court was like. I imagined him telling them that the judge listened, that the court was fair, that not knowing English didn't make him less worthy of respect. That mattered. Before I go any further, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever seen how one respectful interaction can change someone's entire view of authority? Or have you ever experienced it yourself? Leave me a comment and tell me about it. And if this story is resonating with you, hit that like button for me. As the weeks passed, that case stayed with me. Not because it was complex, but because it was clear. It reminded me that justice doesn't always need force. Sometimes it needs patience. I began noticing language barriers more carefully after that. Not just obvious ones, but subtle ones. Hesitation, over-apologizing, people nodding without really understanding. Those are signs. And when you notice them, you have a choice. You can push forward and risk misunderstanding. Or you can slow down and create space for clarity. That day reaffirmed something I've believed for a long time. Respect isn't a reward for speaking perfectly or behaving confidently. It's a baseline. Everyone deserves it the moment they walk into a courtroom. I also thought about the courtroom that day, how no one laughed, no one whispered, how the silence after the ruling felt different from other silences. It wasn't awkward, it was affirming. People understood that something right had happened. Later that month, I was at a community event when a man approached me. He introduced himself and said he had been in the courtroom that day. He said watching that case changed how he viewed the justice system. He said he'd always thought courts were about catching people making mistakes. That day showed him courts could also be about understanding them. I thanked him for saying that. I told him that's exactly how I hope people feel when they leave. That conversation stayed with me too. The truth is, every judge has the power to either build trust or erode it. Every small decision contributes to how people see the law. That day, using a translator wasn't a procedural detail. It was a statement that said everyone's voice matters. I thought about how often people equate fairness with sameness, treating everyone exactly the same, regardless of circumstance. But fairness isn't sameness. Fairness is giving people what they need to be understood. Language is one of those needs. I realized that day how easily respect can be restored when someone in authority chooses humility, when they admit the system needs to adapt, not the person. That man didn't need to change who he was to deserve justice. The system needed to meet him where he was. As I reflected on all of this, I knew there was still one more part of the story to share. Not another ruling, not another encounter, but the lesson that stayed with me and why this case reinforced something I want people to remember about justice in this country. Stay with me, because in the next part, I'll tell you what this moment ultimately taught me, how it connects to my own family's history, and why showing respect can sometimes be the most powerful decision a judge makes. As time passed, that case didn't fade the way many others do. It stayed with me quietly, surfacing in my thoughts when I least expected it. Not because of the ruling itself, but because of what it represented. It reminded me that sometimes the most important decisions aren't written in bold letters on an order. They're written in the way a person walks out of the room. I began to notice something after that day. When people with limited English stood before me, they carried a familiar tension, a hesitation in their voice, an instinct to apologize before they'd even spoken. That man helped sharpen my awareness of those signs. He reminded me how easy it is to overlook fear when you're used to authority. One afternoon, weeks later, I was reviewing files when Christina mentioned that a local community center had reached out to the courthouse. They wanted to thank the court for being respectful to non-English speakers. That caught my attention. I asked her what they meant. She explained that the immigrant father had shared his experience with others in his community. He told them that when he went to court, he was listened to, that a translator was used, that he was treated with dignity. She said word traveled quickly. I sat back in my chair when I heard that. It struck me that one moment in one courtroom had rippled outward, not dramatically, not loudly, but meaningfully. People who had been afraid of the system now felt a little less afraid. People who expected judgment instead experienced respect. That's how trust is built, quietly. I thought again about my own father, about how he arrived in this country with an accent people sometimes mocked, about how he worked long hours, paid his dues, and rarely complained. He didn't ask for special treatment. He just wanted fairness. He wanted to be understood. I remember him telling me once that learning English was the hardest part of starting over, not because he didn't want to learn, but because mistakes made him feel exposed. He said every mispronounced word felt like a spotlight. That memory came rushing back to me. I imagined my father standing where that man stood, trying to explain himself, hoping someone would listen instead of dismiss him. And I realized something. The respect I showed that immigrant father wasn't extraordinary. It was overdue. It was the bare minimum justice should offer. Before I continue, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever seen how one act of respect can change how people talk about an entire system, or how fear can be replaced by trust? If you have, share it in the comments. And if you're still with me, hit that like button for me. As judges, we're taught to apply the law consistently, and that's important, but consistency doesn't mean ignoring context. It doesn't mean pretending everyone stands on equal footing when they don't. True consistency means applying fairness with awareness. That man didn't ask for his ticket to be dismissed because he was an immigrant. He didn't ask for sympathy. He asked to be understood. Once that happened, the facts spoke for themselves. I've seen what happens when courts fail to do that. People stop showing up. They stop trusting outcomes. They stop believing the law is for them. That's dangerous, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole. After that case, I made a conscious effort to remind everyone in my courtroom of something simple. If you don't understand, say so. If you need help communicating, ask. And if someone is struggling to express themselves, slow down. That culture shift matters. I also noticed how court staff responded. Clerks became more attentive. Translators were requested more readily. No one treated it like an inconvenience. It became part of how the system worked, the way it should have been all along. One morning, months later, I saw a man step into my courtroom who reminded me of him. Same nervous posture, same hesitant eyes. Before he could even apologize, I asked if he was comfortable with English. He nodded no. I called for a translator immediately. The look on his face told me everything. That's when I knew the lesson had stuck. The law didn't change that day. The rules didn't change. But the way they were applied did. And sometimes that's what justice needs most. Not reform, not overhaul, just awareness. I reflected often on how easily dignity can be restored when someone in authority acknowledges their power and uses it carefully. Respect doesn't weaken authority, it strengthens it. That immigrant father walked into court afraid of being misunderstood. He walked out believing the system could be fair. That belief matters more than we often realize. As I look back now, I see that case as more than a moment of patience. It was a reminder of who the justice system is meant to serve. Not just fluent speakers, not just confident people, everyone. In the final part of this story, I want to bring everything together. I want to reflect on what this man taught me, why respect should never depend on language, and why justice must always be willing to listen before it judges. I think about that man often, especially on mornings when my courtroom feels busy and rushed. After 40 years on this bench, it's easy to let routine take over. Files stack up, cases blur together. But that day reminded me why slowing down is sometimes the most important thing a judge can do. That immigrant father didn't teach me anything new about the law. The law was already there, clear, simple. What he reminded me of was something deeper. He reminded me that justice begins long before a ruling is spoken. It begins the moment someone feels seen. When he first stood in front of me, unable to explain himself in English, the risk wasn't that he would lose a case. The real risk was that he would lose dignity, and dignity once lost is hard to get back. I've said this many times and I'll say it again. Language does not define character. An accent does not measure honesty. Silence does not equal guilt. Those are lessons I've learned not from books, but from people who stood where that man stood. My father came to this country with an accent that never fully disappeared. He worked hard. He followed the rules. But I know there were moments when people spoke around him instead of to him. Moments when he nodded along even if he didn't fully understand, because asking questions felt risky. I think about how different his experience might have been if someone had simply slowed down and listened. That's why this case mattered to me. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was complicated, but because it showed how easily justice can fail if we mistake efficiency for fairness. When I chose to use a translator that day, I wasn't doing something extraordinary. I was doing something necessary. I was saying that understanding comes before judgment, that respect comes before authority, and the reaction in that courtroom told me everything I needed to know. No applause, no noise, just silence, the kind of silence that means people recognize something true when they see it. That silence told me the courtroom understood that justice had been done in the right way. I've learned over the years that people don't remember statutes or procedures. They remember how they were treated. That man will remember that the court listened. His children will remember that their father was respected. And that matters more than any fine or dismissal ever could. The justice system doesn't belong to people who speak perfect English. It belongs to everyone who lives under its rules. And if the system can't hear someone because of language, then the system has failed its responsibility. I refuse to let that happen in my courtroom. So let me ask you this. Do you think I did the right thing by slowing everything down and using a translator? Or do you think the court should have just pushed forward and treated it like any other case? I'm genuinely curious what you think. And here's another question for you. If you were standing in that courtroom, unable to explain yourself in a language you're still learning, how would you want to be treated? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I actually read them, every single one. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that respect belongs in justice, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Turn on that bell icon so you never miss another story from my courtroom. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Someone who's ever felt judged for how they speak. Someone who's ever felt invisible because they couldn't find the right words. And check out the next video on your screen. I've got another powerful story from my courtroom that you won't believe. I'll see you tomorrow with another lesson about justice, dignity, and what really matters in this life. I'm Frank Caprio. I've been on this bench for 40 years because I believe something simple. We're all equal before the law, every single one of us. Equality means being heard. Equality means being understood. And equality means respect, no matter where you're from or how you speak. Thank you for listening to my story. God bless you. And remember, justice doesn't begin with words. It begins with listening.